Hey, what up, everybody? This is Stevie Breach coming to you here with a look back at one of the best WWE DVDs to have in your collection. Of course, this would be the Rise and Fall of WCW. I chose to take a look at this one with the upcoming Sting DVD being released on Tuesday. WCW is going to be a hot topic this week here on the YouTubes with the YWC. This, honestly, I think WWE sort of released this, but by the time this had come out, they had already had the success of the Rise and Fall of ECW DVD, and I think that really surpassed all of their expectations. And honestly, in my mind, I think that by them putting out their first full, true WCW release, this honestly blew WWE DVD's mind as well, at how much people wanted to have footage from WCW. Since the Rise and Fall of WCW, we've seen a Goldberg set, a Starrcade set, lots of any way you can put out any WCW footage. We've got 3 volumes of the best of WCW, best of the WCW pay-per-views. I could go on and on about all of the releases that they've put out, just featuring strictly WCW stuff, but a really nice cover here. You get just about every era of WCW. Start right up there at the top with the legends of Ric Flair and Dusty Rhodes, the people that paved the way for WCW, and then you have right down here your groundbreakers. You've got the NWO with Scott Hall, Kevin Nash, and Hollywood Hulk Hogan. Eric Bischoff there with the black leather jacket in his NWO days. You've got Sting and you've got Goldberg, your two sort of cornerstones of WCW blowing up. Of course, Sting would be one of the biggest rivals of the NWO, and then of course Goldberg would be built up to fight them as well. Right there. Once we flip in, we've got 3 discs of action here. You've got an awesome Goldberg intro right there as his entrance is coming down. You've got the 2 of the 4 horsemen. Who knows where Mongo or Benoit or Malenko or any of the guys that they want to put in there with them. Who knows where they're at. You've got Sting. You've got Scott Hall and Kevin Nash. You got Hollywood Hulk Hogan with the NWO belts. I need to look that up today. I have no idea when Steve Mongo McMichael left WCW. Was it a good leave? Was it a bad leave? Was it as his contract ended? All of a sudden one day he wasn't in the Horsemen anymore. I have no idea. It's something I've never thought about until right now. Here is your, I guess here's your discs. First, disc 1, disc 2, disc 3. Are they even labeled? Oh, they're right there at the very top. Okay. But you have a cover slip in here so you can flip through the matches of this one. You got a long documentary starting with Jim Crockett Promotions, Mid-Atlantic, lots of things all the way into the death of WCW, all the way at the very end. Some special features there on the end. Then you go over to disc 2, and you're just filled up with matches. You've got Flair versus Magnum Ta in 1985. Looks like you got Sting, Luger, Barry Windham versus Ric Flair, Arn, and Tully. Then you go on to the Great American Bash. You've got Dusty versus Barry Windham, Flair versus Steamboat, the Rock and Roll Express against the Midnight Express, the Midnight Express versus the Southern Boys. The Southern Boys is a great tag team that honestly you don't really hear talked about that much. You know, they're not the Rock and Roll Express, they're not the Midnight Express, but they were a very good tag team. The Steiner brothers versus Sting and Lex Luger. We got Sting versus Vader at the Great American Bash of 92. Rude versus Sting. Flair versus Hogan in 94. And honestly, up until the point of this Flair versus Hogan match, everything that's above there, Rude versus Sting in 94 all the way to the top, these are going to be some of the best matches that WCW has to offer. I mean, this is pretty much the greatest hits of WCW. You cannot go wrong with this. Flair versus Steamboat, Chi-Town Rumble of 1989 is possibly one of the best wrestling matches of all time. No fucking around. And then from here, it sort of goes downhill a little bit, with like Flair versus Giant on Nitro of 96. Mysterio versus Malenko is a great match. Team WCW against Team Nwo at Wargames 96. I just heard them review that on the Brian and Vinny show. I remember, they say that Dave Meltzer really panned this as a bad Wargames match, but Brian and Vinny really stuck up for it, saying that it was a good match. Can't go wrong. You got Sting coming down as NWO Sting, and then of course the real Sting would come out, run wild, but then turn on Luger, Flair, and Arn by walking out of the match for thinking that he had turned on them. From there we go to Syxx versus Eddie Guerrero. This is a sold-out ladder match from 1997. I honestly think this is one of the worst ladder matches of all time, and I have no idea why they chose this match to put on there, but maybe they just wanted to show how over the NWO got by showing that they had their own pay-per-view with Sold Out in 1997. Guerrero versus Malenko at Uncensored of 97. Jericho versus Juventud Guerrero in 98. The Steiners versus the Outsiders in 98. DDP and Karl Malone versus Hogan and Rodman. Goldberg versus Page, Halloween Havoc, 1998. Of course, this would be the show that the power went out. Or not the power went out, but the show went off the air. I apologize. And then August of 2000, Booker T versus Lance Storm. So, as you can see, Disc 3 loses a lot of steam. But you can pretty much look at Disc 2 as the greatest matches in WCW history. You got a great documentary here. Everybody should own this DVD already. But if you don't, this is one that honestly you can pick up pretty cheap off of Amazon and add it to your collection, and it would be a great one to have. You see, the Rise and Fall of WCW examines the the storied history of World Championship Wrestling from its beginnings in a territory system through Ted Turner's acquisition and the savage battles with WWE for sports entertainment dominance in the 1990s. Lots of great matches on there for you, but there's Flair versus Hogan wrestling. Of course, you never got to see that match in mainstream WWF back in the day. You had to wait until they finally signed with WCW in order to see it. So there you go, the Rise and Fall of WCW, greatest WCW DVD of all time. Hey, what is up, everybody? This is the Breach coming to you last night. Earlier this week, we took a look into the Rise of Fall of WCW. Last night, I woke up at like 2 in the morning for some unknown reason, and I couldn't fall back asleep. So I flipped on the WWE Network. I watched a few of the short shows, such as like Unfiltered with Renee Young. One thing led to another. I ended up checking out the Rise of Fall of WCW. I thought I would do a review of the documentary that came along with it. It was a really, really good documentary. Like I said, I've seen this before. It's the first time that I've seen it in a good little while. WCW is one of the the big companies. Of course, a lot of the guys, they like to take credit for almost putting the WWE out of business. I felt that was one of the sort of knocks I had on the table for 3 this week. When I was watching it with DDP, Vader, and with Sting, I basically thought that, all these years later, even though WWE clearly has won the war, DDP was still trying to put himself over as the guy that beat WWE for 2 years in the ratings and basically changed the face of professional wrestling. But all in all, I mean, like, WCW is something that is really thought after by wrestling fans. You can tell by all of the releases from WWE DVDs, such as the Best of Starrcade, the Best of the Great American Bash, the Best of Clash of the Champions, Goldberg, the Rise and Fall of WCW, Best of Nitros 1 through 3, tons and tons of releases of WCW, people wanting to get their hands on this footage. I guess the WWE Network doesn't say that they get a lot of viewers viewing in on the old school Nitros, but it's one of the biggest things that I hear talked about as people going back and checking out the rise of the NWO in 1996 through 1997. Definitely a glory era of professional wrestling in my book. One of the hottest times as being a fan, when you're just sitting there flipping the channels back and forth. They tell an early story, Jim Crockett Promotions coming together. I still am a little bit mixed up. There was a lot of little territories being run back in the day. I've always heard about the Crockett's. I've always heard about Mid-Atlantic, the UWF, and somehow by the NWA, these groups all sort of came together. I'm not sure. The name that I hear about the most, more than anything else, is Jim Crockett, and I don't know if he bought them and merged them all together, but they all belonged to the NWA, which was basically all the territories had one leader, and they came together and they basically voted on who was going to be the champion. And this would sort of be the guy who would travel around to all the different territories. He would work television. He'd worked the shows in order to build up to a big show, and then once the champion was done in one promotion, he would move on to the next one, and he would sort of tour around the country like this. And the one guy that everyone remembers more than anybody else from this era would be Ric Flair. He was sort of like the wrestler of the 80s. He was the guy that just went everywhere and did everything with everybody. One of the greatest champions of all time, and he's one of the the cornerstones of WCW. It came to a time when Vince McMahon was trying to basically take over the whole United States with his worldwide expansion, and he went and basically went to the Superstation. The Superstation was in TBS. It was one of the major cable companies or cable networks, I guess you can say, that was all across the country. So basically, because of this, Jim Crockett Promotions with World Championship Wrestling, which before it was the name of the promotion, was actually the name of the show that was on Saturday nights at 6:05. Vince saw this as a great way to move in. He was having to buy up time slots all across the country by basically putting his show on all over, so that way WWF would be able to tour and people would know who they were. Vince looked at this, went to Turner, basically talked about buying the contract, which he ended up doing, where he would put WWF on in the time slot of World Championship Wrestling. This is known as Black Saturday. It's really weird. You see Vince McMahon standing in front of a World Championship Wrestling poster, and they sort of pass the torch to him. And what the agreement was supposed to be was that Vince would actually be filming his television in Atlanta and be sort of using this to push it out onto TBS. One thing leads to another. I don't think Vince had any plans of going down and filming his television in Atlanta. He just kept on using older Madison Square Garden shows and pushing guys such as Jimmy Superfly Snuka, the Iron Sheik, Big John Studd. Were shown on this, and after about a month, basically, Crockett knew that he needed to get his television back, or his company was going to go down. Ted Turner, he didn't feel that he was, Vince was living up to his agreement. So after about a month, the agreement was made for Vince to sell the time slot back to the Crockett's. And because of this, they paid $1 million to get the time slot back. That is what Vince would use to fund WrestleMania, which would put his company over even more. But without the $1 million and the time slot on TBS, the Crockett's wouldn't have been anything. Even with Dusty Rhodes, Ric Flair, they wouldn't have been able to get everything out there. But because of TBS was so widespread, the promotion started to grow, and that is sort of looked at as one of the reasons why the Crockett promotion failed. They just were spending too much money. They talk about running shows in Chicago, which worked. They were running shows all the way up and down the coast. They said they could get over as far as they went to about Philadelphia. Once they went into New York, that was basically Vince's territory, which didn't really work for them. But they started to go west, which would work. Because of the fact that TBS was spread all the way out there. They were doing shows in Los Angeles. They were doing shows in San Francisco. But the thing is that the Crockett's, they ended up buying 2 jets. They started running the shows on the West Coast, but they would be based out of Las Vegas. So these guys like Ric Flair and Dusty Rhodes, all of these guys that were in the promotion, could feel like big shots, and they were just spending twice as much money as they were making. And at one day, basically, the money man walked into the room and just said, "Hey, we're $5 million in the hole. I mean, there's no way we can pull out of this." And the Crockett's, they had to go to Turner. Turner ended up buying it, and that way the wrestling would stay on TBS, which is one of the things that really built the Superstation. Was just that everybody was watching wrestling, everybody was watching that 605 thing, and they were able to sell ads
to go on there, something that wrestling fans or wrestling companies can't do. Even Monday Night Raw can't demand high ad dollars for what goes on, on there. But from there, Turner would take it over, and basically Turner had to put people in charge of running the company. They went through a few. Of course, everybody knows about the headaches of Jim Herd. Jim Herd is a guy that is known as the Pizza Boy, who just basically didn't know anything about professional wrestling, tried to do everything in the world to basically kill wrestling, it seems like. From there, they went to Cowboy Bill Watts. Cowboy Bill Watts got on WCW almost to the point where their debt was nothing. They weren't making a profit yet, but they were getting really, really close. But basically, Watts couldn't deal with having to deal with the suits inside of Turner. It was no secret that the people that were inside of Turner did not want anything to do with wrestling other than Ted Turner. And he just, he couldn't fight the cause anymore, which made them, bring in new people. Shoot, is it Bill Shaw? I think Bill Shaw is the guy who ends up getting put in charge. He's the president of WCW. He's not a wrestling guy, but he's a guy that can look over the numbers and make sure they're not doing too much. Bill Shaw is the guy who ends up bringing in Eric Bischoff. Eric Bischoff at that time was like a third-rate announcer. He had done announcing for the AWA. He tried out for WWE. He ended up finding himself in WCW. And he was enough of a guy that knew about wrestling but was not a wrestler that the Turner people could trust. So he ends up becoming the vice president of WCW. From there, he is the guy that starts making all of the big deals to make WCW start to grow. The first thing that they're able to do, they hire Hulk Hogan, who is basically, I don't want to say he was shunned away from WWE, but, Vince got to the point where he didn't think Hogan was going to work for them anymore, and they were going in a new direction with Yokozuna, with Shawn Michaels, with Bret Hart. He just basically thought that guys like him, the Macho Man, they'd been used up enough, and there was nothing really left to try and get out of them. The fans were changing. They weren't, all babyface, goody two-shoes. Hogan came in to WCW with a whole lot of fanfare. People knew who Hulk Hogan was. People still wanted to believe in Hulkamania. But honestly, in my mind, WCW was still looked at as the second-rate Bush League promotion. Even with Hogan on top, it just didn't seem like it was going to matter that much. I'm not saying that I didn't watch or I didn't check it out. It just didn't really seem like, the big leagues, even though, they build up Bash at the Beach. The first meeting of Hulk Hogan versus Ric Flair, they had Mr. T there, who was already, past his prime as being a guy, but they had Shaquille O'Neal there, something that they don't talk about all that much. When they talk about all the celebrities that made appearances. This is at the height of Shaq Fu, Shaquille O'Neal being a huge star, and he's there. He raises Hogan's hand. I think he was like the outside enforcer, I think is what his job was at this match, to try and keep the Horsemen out or something like that. But it just, Hogan got the belt, and it just was business as normal. You had him, you had the Horsemen, Macho Man came, but it wasn't until Monday Nitro debuted when Turner gave WCW, he says 2 hours, but I always thought that Nitro always started out as 1 hour, and then when there were ratings behind it, then it got moved to 2 hours. But because of this, we see a change in the game where basically they figure out that a lot of their baby faces need to be, re-upped. They need to be sort of repackaged and re-put back out there, because there's times when it just doesn't work anymore. From there, we see Hulk Hogan turn heel with the birth of the NWO, bringing in Scott Hall and Kevin Nash. Eric Bischoff realized that, WWF was running with these cartoonish gimmicks on the other side, with, everybody having to have a day job. And he just wanted the guys to be real. He started giving them their own real names and their real personas so they can act like themselves. And people connected with that more. The NWO would go on to do huge money for them. Maybe it went a little bit too long. But they were able to reestablish themselves, with bringing in new things to wrestling, such as the cruiserweights. They found a bright new star in Goldberg, who I didn't really talk about, was like the new Magnum Ta for them. Magnum Ta was a wrestler in the 80s who basically had everything that it took to be a big star in the world of professional wrestling. People were in love with this guy. He could work, he could talk, and he got in an accident, and basically it made it where he wasn't going to be able to wrestle anymore. But Goldberg came on, and it was almost like Goldberg was a big push for WCW, but they still had all of the trash and all of the politics that went around that just got it to the point where people wanted to watch Goldberg, or people didn't want to watch everything else that went along with it. Nitro was a big time success. They beat Raw in the ratings for 2 years, but once they probably did Goldberg versus Hogan for the title in the Atlanta Georgia Dome, I think from there it was all downhill from WCW. I think that was probably the last time that they won a night in the ratings war between WWE and WCW. But just because they start highlighting all of the mistakes. Honestly, I know you have to tell the story of WCW dying if you have a DVD called The Rise and Fall of WCW, but just... man, those dying days at WCW were bad. They start talking about all of the celebrities that came into play. Karl Malone, Dennis Rodman, which was big. But then you followed it up with Jay Leno and whatever Jay Leno's bandmate was, and David Arquette and this, that, and the other. They just kept on trying to just do things over and over again that just were not working, and they weren't working. They bring in Vince Russo, who seemed like they thought was going to be the guy to save it, because he was the guy that came up with The Rock and came up with Stone Cold Steve Austin. Vince Russo is a guy that had a whole lot of good ideas, but the one thing that was working for him is that he filters his ideas through Vince McMahon, who I think is one of the biggest wrestling geniuses in the world. And for every 10 ideas that Vince Russo came up with, maybe Vince gave the green light and okayed 2 of them. The day comes when basically WCW says that, or I guess TBS and TNT says that WCW isn't going to be on television anymore. They're not going to have it on either one of their networks. They're pulling the plug. Vince ends up buying WCW. The legacy of WCW lives on today through all of the DVDs and the WWE Network and everything like that. It's something that people just don't want to let go of. It's crazy. I mean, what Dusty Rhodes and Ric Flair built, what Hulk Hogan, Goldberg, and the NWO, are still able to live on today. It's some of the great times. If you go and you pick up the DVD and you look at disc 2, it's got like 10 of the greatest matches of the NWA and the WCW on there. It's a must-have for any WWE DVD collector. A great time in professional wrestling, and it's probably going to live on forever in people's minds.